And now we're about to have the first Daniel Polansky reading. This is sort of the kickoff of his world tour for his new novel. So just a little bit about Daniel's work. Daniel's born in Baltimore, and this is the book right here, Lowtown. Brand new book, straight off the presses of Doubleday. Part of the Lowtown series. I guess there's a bunch of these on their way to you soon. And so Daniel's going to actually take us into this kind of strange world right now. Please welcome Daniel Polansky.
Howdy. Hello. Yes. As Jason mentioned, this is my first reading, so be kind. I'd say thanks so much, Jason, for having me. My name is Daniel Polansky. This is a chapter from my book, Lowtown. I hope it's relatively self-explanatory. But one thing am I speaking close enough to the microphone? Can anyone hear me? Yes. Thank you. But one thing, as I said, as Jason mentioned, is a sort of speculative fiction, so some of the terms are made up. And in particular, there's a term in here, pixie's breath, is more or less analogous to cocaine. So here we go. Back at the staggering row, the weekend trade was in full swing. Adolphus's greeting echoed off the walls as I fought my way through the tight ranks of patrons and took a seat at the bar. He poured a glass of beer and leaned in as he handed it to me. "The boy arrived with your package. I put it in your room." Somehow I had expected the urchin would come through. Adolphus stood there awkwardly, a look of concern on his mangled face. He told me what he found. I took a sip of my drink. "If you want to talk." "I don't." The ale was thick and dark, and I made my way through a half-dozen drafts, trying to get the sight of twisted hands and pale, bruised skin out of my head. The crowd surged around me, factory workers finished with their shifts and bravos planning the night's escapades. We were doing the kind of business that reminded me why I was part owner, but the mass of amiable lowlives imbibing cheap liquor were poor company for my mood. I drained my cup and stood. Adolphus waved away a customer and came over. "You leaving?" I grunted assent. The look on my face must have betokened violence, because he put one huge paw on my arm as I turned away. "You need a blade or company?" I shook my head, and he shrugged and returned to chatting up patrons. I had been saving a visit to Tancred the Hare-Lip since I saw one of his runners moving Dreamvine on my territory a half-month prior. Tancred was a small-time operator who had managed to claw his way to minor prominence by an unsavory combination of cheap violence and low cunning, but he wouldn't be able to hold on to it for more than a few seasons. He'd underpay his boys, or try to cheat the guard out of their percentage, or piss off a syndicate and die in an alley with it pointed at his vitals. I had never seen any great need to hasten his appointment with she who waits behind all things, but mistakes don't get made in our business. Selling on my territory was sending me a message, and etiquette demanded a response. Hare-Lip had carved a thin slice of turf west of the canal, near Off-Bend, and he ran his operations from a dump of a bar called the Bleeding Virgin. He made most of his money from the trades that were too small or ugly for the syndicate boys to touch, moving worm and bleeding protection money out of whatever neighboring merchants were pitiful enough to pay. It was a long walk to his shit establishment, but it would give me time to clear my head from the booze. I went upstairs to retrieve a bottle of Pixie's breath and started over. The west end of Lowtown was quiet, the merchants gone home and the nightlife pressed toward the docks, so I walked a dozen blocks to the canal in relative solitude. This late in the evening, the Herm Bridge looked ominous instead of just dilapidated, its marble features made indistinct by time and petty vandalism. The ragged hands of Stone Davis curled in supplication to the heavens, their faces worn to wide eyes and gaping mouths. Beneath it, the river Andal ran sluggish and slow, carrying the city's wastes in a stately procession toward the harbor and out to sea. I continued on, stopping at the entrance of a nondescript building a half-mile west. Noise from the second floor drifted down to the shadows beneath. I took a hit of breath, then another and another, until the bottle was empty and the buzzing was like a crowd of bees swarming around my ears. I dashed it against the wall and took the steps 2 at a time. The Bleeding Virgin was the kind of diet that made you want to scrub your skin with lye as soon as you walked out. It made the atmosphere at the Earl look like high tea at the royal court. Torches shed greasy light on the unpalatable interior, a crumbling wooden infrastructure set over a handful of rooms that Hare-Lip rented by the hour, along with a stable of sad-looking whores. These last doubles as servers, the dim illumination sufficient to display a lengthy commitment to their vocation. I grabbed a spot across from a breach in the wall that served duty as a window and waved down one of the waitresses. "You know who I am?" I asked. She nodded, dun hair atop a stretched face, crooked eyes, dull and unfazed. Get me something that hasn't been spit in and tell your boss I'm here. I flipped her a copper and watched her walk off warily. The breath was kicking in hard, and I held my fists tight at my sides to keep them from shaking. I glared at the patrons warily and thought about how far one well-placed act of arson would go toward improving the neighborhood. The server returned a few minutes later with a half-full tankard. "He'll be out soon," she said. The beer was mostly rainwater. I choked it down and tried not to think about the child. The back door opened and Hairlip and two of his boys slid in. Tankard was aptly named. The crevice in his face split his mouth straight through. An aberration his thick beard did nothing to hide. Beyond that, there was little to recommend him one way or the other. Somewhere along the line, he had acquired a reputation for being a hard man, though I suspected this was an outgrowth of his deformity. The two hangers-on looked violent and stupid, the kind of cheap street toughs Tankard liked to keep around. I knew the first, Spider, a squat half-islander runt with a lazy eye he picked up from getting rambunctious around a troop of guardsmen. He used to run with a small-time crew of river rats, busting into cargo barges late at night and making off with whatever they could find. I'd never seen the second, but his pockmarked face and sour odor bespoke ill breeding as surely as his surroundings and choice of career. I assumed they were both armed, but only Spider's weapon was visible, an ugly-looking dirk that jutted obtrusively from his belt. They fanned out to cover me. "Hello, Tankard. What's the good word?" He sneered at me, or maybe he didn't. The lip made it tough to tell. "I hear you people have been having trouble with their lodestones," I continued. Now I was pretty confident he was sneering. "Trouble? How do you mean?" "The canal is the line between our two enterprises, Tankard. You know the canal. It's that big ditch to the east of here, filled with water." He smiled, the fleshless stretch between his upper lip and nose rendering his rotting gums starkly visible. "Was that the line? In our business, it's important to remember your agreements. If you're having trouble, it might be time to look for work more in keeping with your natural talents. You make a lovely chorus girl." "You've got a sharp mouth," he growled, "and you've got a crooked one, but we are as the Creator formed us. Regardless, Tankard, I'm not here to debate theology. Geography is the interest of the moment. So why don't you go ahead and remind me where our boundary is?" Hairlip took a step backward, and his boys moved closer. "Seems to me it might be time to redraw our map. I don't know what you've got going with the syndicates, and I don't care how friendly you are with the guard. You don't have the muscle to hold the land you got. As far as I can tell, you're an independent operator, and there ain't no place for an independent operator these days." He kept nerving himself from the conflict that was coming, but I could barely hear him with the drone in my ears. Not that the particulars of his monologue much mattered. I hadn't come over here for discussion, and he hadn't rolled out his mob to help him negotiate. The ringing faded as Tankard completed whatever ultimatum he was making. Spider rested a hand on his weapon. The unnamed thug flicked his tongue off a toothy grin. Somehow they had fallen under the impression that this was going to go easy. I was looking forward to disabusing him. I finished my last swallow of ale and dropped the tankard with my left hand. Spider watched it shatter on the ground, and I lashed out with my right fist, breaking his nose back into his face. Before his partner could draw a weapon, I wrapped my arms around his shoulder and launched us both through the open window behind him. For a half second, all I could hear was the rush of the wind and the rapid pulse of my heart. Then we hit the ground, and my 180-pound frame buried him face up in the mud, a low crack letting me know the fall had broken a few of his ribs. I rolled off him and pulled myself to my feet. The moon was very bright against the dark of the alleyway. I breathed in deep and felt the blood drain from my head. The pockmarked man struggled to right himself, and I snapped a boot across his scalp. He groaned and stopped stirring. Dimly I was aware that the fall had done something to my ankle, but I was too gone to feel it. I would need to finish this quick before my body had time to wake to the harm I'd done it. I walked back into the Virgin and saw Spider sprinting down the steps at full speed, blood seeping from his nose, his blade in his hand. He snarled and came at me wildly. Foolish, but then Spider was the sort of man who gets rattled by a little pain. I met him halfway and dropped low, setting my shoulder into his knees and sending him hurtling down the stairs. Turning back to finish the job, I saw the white press of bone sticking out from his hand and knew there was no point in further violence. I left him cradling his wrist and shrieking like a newborn. Back on the second floor, the patrons were pressed against the walls, waiting to see the outcome. At some point while I was busy below, Tankard had grabbed a heavy wooden truncheon, and he was rapping it against his outstretched palm. His warped face was twisted into a death mask, and there was a long line of notches on the handle of his club, but his eyes were wide, and I knew he would go down easy. I ducked as his cudgel weaved over my head, then balled my fist into his stomach. Tankard stumbled backwards, gasping for air, waving his bludgeon impotently. On the second swing, I caught his wrist and twisted it savagely, pulling him close as he screamed and dropped his weapon. I held his gaze with mine, his ruined lips trembling, then struck him a blow that collapsed his legs under him. He lay at my feet, weeping piteously. The small crowd of spectators stared back at me, bulbous drunkard noses and mongoloid eyes, a menagerie of inbred grotesques, mouth breathers and vermin. I had the urge to grab Tankard's cudgel and wade into them, just start clubbing heads, crack, 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 soak the sawdust red. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a breath. It was time to end this, but not too quickly. Theatricality mattered. I wanted these regs to spread what they were saying. I dragged Hairlip's limp body toward a nearby table and stretched one arm across the wood. Holding his palm flat with my left hand, I took his small digit firmly in my right. "What's our boundary?" I asked, snapping his digit. He screamed but didn't answer. "What's our boundary?" I continued, breaking the next finger. He was weeping now, gasping for air and barely capable of speech. He needed to make the attempt. I twisted another finger. "You've got a whole other hand I haven't touched." I was laughing and wasn't sure if it was part of the act. "What's our boundary?" "The canal," he shrieked. "The canal is the boundary." The bar was silent but for his wailing. I swiveled my head at the onlookers, savoring the moment. Then he continued in a voice loud enough to be heard by the first ranks of the audience. "Your business ends at the canal. Forget again and they'll find you floating in it." I pulled back his last finger and let him fall to the ground, then turned and walked slowly out. Spider sat slumped against the bottom of the stairs, and he looked away as I passed. A dozen blocks east, the breath wore off, and I put my arm against an alley wall and spewed until I could barely breathe, sinking into the muck and grime. I knelt there for a while, waiting for my heartbeat to return to normal. On the way up, my leg gave out, and I had to buy a crutch off a fake cripple so I could hobble the rest of the way home.